Sandra had been presenting Rachel's work as her own for 3 years. Rachel knew it for 2 months before she finally did anything about it. No angry email. No confrontation. No dramatic meeting with HR. She just stopped helping her. And Sandra found herself sitting inside a glass-walled boardroom while 4 senior partners asked her to explain work she had never actually done. Rachel was already in the room, standing at the front. To understand what happened in that boardroom, you need to understand what Sandra was to Rachel before she became what she became. Rachel joined the firm at 26. Not nervous exactly. Just very aware she needed this job to work. She had already spent 3 years at a smaller agency where people repeated her ideas back to her in meetings like they invented them themselves. She came into the new firm determined not to disappear professionally again. Sandra found her in the first week. Senior director. 15 years older. The kind of person who made rooms subtly reorganize themselves when she walked inside. Rachel's 4th day, Sandra invited her to lunch. By the 2nd month, Sandra was introducing her to clients, explaining internal politics, warning her which executives loved confidence and which punished it. And honestly, some of that guidance genuinely helped Rachel. Sandra stayed late once rebuilding an entire presentation with her before a major pitch. She taught Rachel how to pace a room, how to hold back ideas until the right moment, how visibility inside companies was often about timing more than intelligence. Rachel respected her deeply. That matters. Because Sandra wasn't fake in every direction. She was genuinely brilliant. And genuinely warm. That combination is dangerous. There was this thing Sandra used to do during meetings. If Rachel started explaining something too early, Sandra would lightly touch her wrist under the table and quietly say, "Not yet. Let them come to you first." Afterward, Sandra would explain that inexperienced people ruined opportunities by showing too much too soon. Rachel believed her. There used to be another analyst before Rachel. Claire. Rachel only heard the name twice during her first year. Always vaguely. Always quickly. She left for nonprofit work. Burned out maybe? Nobody really explained. One afternoon, Sandra caught Rachel sending unfinished draft slides before a strategy review. Sandra smiled and said, "The most important thing I ever learned in this business is to never let anyone see the full picture until you're ready to present it. Keep your best work close. Show it at exactly the right moment. Not a second before." Rachel wrote that sentence down in the small black notebook she kept inside her desk drawer. At the time, she thought she was learning how successful people protected their work. She was learning something. Just not what she thought. The first thing Rachel found out about was the Henderson report. 11 straight days of work. Late nights. Takeout containers. Coffee going cold beside her keyboard while she rebuilt 4 years of disorganized data into something executives could actually use. Thursday night, she sent the completed draft to Sandra for review. Sandra replied 30 minutes later. "Brilliant work. Let's discuss Monday." Sandra presented it to the executive committee the following morning, with her own name on it. Rachel found out because a coworker congratulated Sandra in the hallway while Rachel was standing there. The coworker looked at Rachel afterward and said, "Oh, I thought you knew." Rachel smiled automatically. The kind of smile people make while their brain is still trying to catch up. She walked back to her desk, sat down, opened the same spreadsheet 3 times without actually reading anything, then closed it again. That was layer 1. At first she tried explaining it away. Maybe Sandra forgot. Maybe something happened higher up. Maybe her name disappeared accidentally. Then Rachel started looking backward. The Morrison pitch she'd been told she was too junior to present, Sandra presented Rachel's framework almost slide for slide. The restructuring proposal Sandra claimed took her entire weekend. Rachel built most of it while Sandra was supposedly handling executive strategy. 3 years. Not one misunderstanding. Not one isolated incident. Once Rachel saw the pattern, she couldn't stop seeing it. Every time Sandra insisted on privately reviewing presentations before executives saw them. Every time Sandra redirected client communication through herself to protect Rachel politically. Every time Sandra discouraged Rachel from presenting directly. Suddenly all of it sounded different in her head. That was layer 2. But the thing that actually broke something inside her was the promotion email. Rachel had been passed over 3 separate times. Each time Sandra sat beside her afterward and said some version of, "I'm fighting for you behind closed doors. They just don't see yet what I see." Rachel believed her. Then operations accidentally forwarded Rachel an internal email thread. 8 months earlier Sandra had written, "Rachel shows genuine promise but still lacks the strategic vision necessary for a senior director role." Rachel stared at the screen for a very long time. Because earlier that same week Sandra presented Rachel's strategic market framework inside a leadership meeting. As her own. Rachel reread the email 3 times. Then shut her laptop. Picked up her bag. And sat inside her car in the parking garage for almost an hour without turning the engine on. The fluorescent light above her space buzzed the entire time. At one point she opened a draft email to HR. "I believe my work has been repeatedly misrepresented by my direct supervisor." She deleted the sentence. Then typed it again. Then deleted it again. Rachel came into work the next morning and said nothing. That was a choice. And not an entirely admirable one. She already had enough to raise serious questions. The timestamps. The files. The drafts. A different person might have gone straight to HR, Rachel didn't. Partly because Sandra had positioned herself so carefully inside the company Rachel couldn't fully imagine winning that fight. But also because Rachel wanted certainty. Not suspicion. So she started documenting. Quietly. Methodically. Folders. Dates. Email chains. Metadata. Presentation versions. She stopped sharing unfinished work. Stopped volunteering exploratory ideas casually in meetings. Stopped sending loose strategy notes Sandra could reshape later. Sandra noticed eventually. Not directly. Never directly. But she started hovering around Rachel's desk more often. Asking strange little questions. "How's the Meridian proposal going? Still refining the assumptions? You know you don't have to carry all this alone, right?" Always smiling. Always warm. One afternoon Sandra stood behind Rachel's chair while she worked. Not close enough to be inappropriate. Just close enough Rachel became aware of her own breathing. Sandra rested a hand lightly on the cubicle wall and said, "You've seemed distant lately." Rachel said she was tired. Sandra nodded slowly like she understood more than Rachel actually said. Then Tom Aldridge got fired. Tom was 24. Junior analyst. Smart in the uneven way young analysts usually are. He had been helping Rachel on a project Sandra quietly redirected midway through development. Rachel watched it happen. Sandra changed deliverables without properly communicating it, then positioned the confusion like it was Tom's failure. Tom looked genuinely blindsided in the termination meeting. Rachel knew he wasn't fully responsible. And by then she already had enough evidence to raise serious concerns about Sandra generally. Maybe not enough to destroy her career, but enough to complicate the narrative around Tom. Rachel said nothing. Because she was still building the folder. And here's the part one honestly don't know how to judge. If you were Rachel, after 3 years of being quietly used by someone more powerful than you, would you risk exposing yourself early to save Tom? Or would you keep documenting until the case became impossible to dismiss? Because people love imagining they do the brave thing immediately. But most people become cautious once they understand how power actually works inside organizations. Tom packed his desk into a cardboard box that Friday. Rachel watched from across the office while pretending to answer emails. At one point Tom looked around like he expected somebody to stop him from leaving. Nobody did. Rachel went home that night and threw up in her kitchen sink. Not because of Tom exactly. Because she realized she had started thinking strategically about another person's life. And she hated that about herself. 3 weeks later, Sandra took Rachel to lunch at the Italian restaurant on Clement Street they'd been going to since Rachel's first year. And for a little while it was just normal. Sandra complained about a client everybody hated. She laughed so hard at one point she accidentally snorted into her wine glass and immediately looked embarrassed afterward. Rachel laughed too. A real laugh. Sandra asked about Rachel's sister. Remembered the surgery date. Remembered the medication complications. Remembered details Rachel herself forgot mentioning. At one point Sandra brushed breadcrumbs off Rachel's sleeve while talking. The gesture so absent-minded and familiar it made Rachel feel suddenly disoriented. Like her body still trusted someone her mind no longer did. Sandra was generous sometimes. Funny. Protective even. She was also stealing Rachel's career one careful piece at a time. Rachel sat in the parking garage afterward gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles hurt. Because for almost 2 straight hours she forgot to be angry. And honestly, she sat there another 10 minutes before starting the car. If this story is hitting something real for you, hit like and subscribe. These stories only reach the people who need them when someone decides they're worth sharing. Now, back to Rachel. The folder had 41 entries by the time Rachel considered it complete. 41. Projects. Client strategies. Internal frameworks. Market analysis. Dates sent. Dates presented. Versions edited. Patterns. She printed everything at home. Not at work. Sunday evening Rachel spread the documents across her kitchen table. The apartment completely silent except for refrigerator hum and distant traffic outside. Around entry 23, Rachel stopped seeing isolated incidents. Until then she thought Sandra stole opportunities. But this wasn't opportunistic. Sandra built an ecosystem. The mentorship. The protection. The access. The strategic advice. The insistence on privately reviewing work before anyone else saw it. All of it fed the same machine. Rachel suddenly remembered how often Sandra discouraged her from presenting directly to executives. Visibility too early can hurt you. Let me handle the politics first. You're not ready for that room yet. At the time it sounded protective. Now it sounded like inventory management. Rachel stared at the notebook page she wrote years earlier. Never let anyone see the full picture until you're ready. She used to hear that sentence as professional wisdom. Now she heard something else. Sandra had been describing herself. Not metaphorically. Literally. The mentorship was never separate from the theft. It was the delivery system. And the worst part? Sandra probably believed parts of the mentorship were real. Because it meant Sandra likely never experienced herself as a villain. Just necessary. Rachel closed the folder. Then she made a decision. Quietly. Without drama. No emotional confrontation. No pleading. No giving Sandra space to control the narrative first. Rachel would simply stop feeding the system. And then she would present the Meridian proposal herself. The largest account the firm pursued in 4 years. Sandra had already mentioned Meridian repeatedly to leadership as something she was personally overseeing. The problem was Sandra had never actually seen the finished work. Rachel kept Meridian on a private drive Sandra couldn't access. For the first time in 3 years, Sandra didn't know the full picture. The next 2 weeks felt strangely calm. Rachel arrived early, left late, practiced answers while driving, rehearsed transitions under her breath while making coffee. Twice she caught herself imagining Sandra's face inside the boardroom. And both times she immediately felt sick afterward. Not guilty exactly. Just aware something irreversible was coming. The morning of the presentation, Rachel arrived 40 minutes early. She set up the room herself. Adjusted the projector alignment twice because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her name sat alone on the cover page. Rachel Mercer. Nobody else. The board meeting started. Sandra arrived early. She walked into the room mid-conversation and stopped very slightly when she saw Rachel standing beside the projector screen. Not enough anybody else would necessarily notice. But Rachel noticed. It wasn't panic. Not yet. It looked more like somebody mentally recalculating. Sandra recovered quickly. Smiled. Took her seat. Rachel presented for 38 minutes. And she was good. Not aggressive. Not performative. Just deeply prepared. She knew every assumption underneath the data. Every weakness in the projections. Every likely objection before it surfaced. About halfway through, a board member interrupted to challenge a segmentation model. For half a second Rachel lost her place. Her throat tightened. And suddenly she had this awful flash of Sandra smoothly stepping in to rescue the presentation the way she had dozens of times before. Rachel instinctively looked toward her. Sandra met her eyes. Completely calm. Then Rachel corrected herself and kept going. By the end of the presentation, the room felt different. Sharper somehow. More attentive. The managing partner asked 3 follow-up questions. Rachel answered all 3. Then he turned toward Sandra. Sandra, you mentioned last week you were closely involved in developing this proposal. Can you walk us through the methodology behind the market segmentation framework in Section 4? The room went still. Sandra looked down at the proposal. Section 4. The framework Rachel built privately over 6 weeks. Using methodology Sandra had never seen. Using data Sandra didn't even know existed. Sandra started answering. Stopped. Started again. Different wording. Different direction. Stopped again. Nobody moved. The managing partner simply waited. People understood. Not fully yet. But enough. Sandra finally said she would need to pull her notes. There were no notes. Everybody knew there were no notes. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. No confrontation. No accusation. Rachel stepped into the hallway afterward and leaned against the wall because suddenly her legs didn't feel reliable anymore. And here's the question that still sits strangely with me. Sandra absolutely deserved consequences. That part isn't complicated. But Rachel waited 2 months. Tom still lost his job. Claire still disappeared from the company. The folder didn't change that. Would you have done it differently? Seriously. Would you risk exposing yourself early with incomplete evidence? Or would you wait until the person hurting you couldn't possibly escape? Because I honestly think most people say one thing publicly and choose another privately. The formal review started less than a week later. Rachel submitted the folder quietly through the managing partner's office. 41 documented incidents. Sandra resigned before the investigation formally concluded. Rachel was still standing in the hallway after the meeting when Sandra's assistant approached her. Priya, 23 years old. At the company less than a year. Priya looked nervous even speaking. Then she said, "There was someone before you." Rachel didn't answer. Her name was Claire. Priya swallowed. She tried to tell people. Nobody listened. After a while she just stopped talking about it. Rachel looked away for a second after that. Because suddenly Claire wasn't abstract anymore. Sandra had done this long enough that the pattern had a history. And Rachel stood there realizing she only ended it because she survived long enough to gather evidence. Rachel lasted longer than Claire did. Rachel got the Meridian account. 6 months later she got the senior director position too. But the part that stayed with her wasn't the promotion. It was Claire. 3 weeks after the board meeting Rachel found her on LinkedIn. Working communications for a non-profit 4 hours away. Claire looked careful. That's the only word Rachel ever used. Her profile read like somebody trying very hard not to fail publicly again. Rachel opened a message window 3 separate times. The first draft started, "I think I know what happened to you." She deleted that immediately. The second draft was longer. More apologetic somehow. She deleted that too. Because the truth was ugly. Rachel didn't know whether contacting Claire would help Claire. Or help Rachel feel less guilty about surviving something Claire didn't. And that distinction mattered. Sandra did not create this system specifically for Rachel. Rachel lasted longer than Claire did. That realization changed everything. Not cynically. Not completely. But carefully. Rachel still keeps the folder. 41 entries. Not because she needs proof anymore. Because sometimes she opens it and remembers how easy it became to delay the truth once she convinced herself the delay was strategic. That part still bothers her. The promotion was real. The justice was real. So was the cost of waiting. Those things don't cancel each other out. They stayed there together anyway. If you've ever stayed quiet because timing felt safer than truth in that moment, you probably already understand why Rachel still thinks about that parking garage. Leave a comment below. Would you have waited like Rachel did? Or would you have moved sooner? I read every one. And if this story reached someone who needed to hear it, share it. That's the only thing that actually matters.